Hello everyone, welcome to my class. This is a class for English major students. Today we're going to study a little bit about relative clauses, and my name is Quyên Nguyen from Thong Hong High School for the Gifted. Relative clauses modify, define, describe, identify, or give information about nouns. In a subject relative clause, the relative pronoun is the subject of the clause. An identifying relative clause gives essential information about the noun it modifies. For example, I go to a gym, the gym creates its own electricity. And I go to the gym that creates its own electricity. The gym is a subject of the second sentence, and we need a relative pronoun that to replace the gym. Okay, I bet this is not difficult for us to form identifying subject relative clause. But remember that the subject of an identifying subject relative clause is the relative pronoun. The relative pronoun refers to the noun before it. And remember that we use who or that for people and which or that for things. For example, nowadays people often drive cars that don't use a lot of gas. And we have the noun cars, we have the relative pronoun that, and the relative pronoun that can replace car in the sentence. And remember that do not add a second subject to the clauses. For example, people that exercise can use special machine to create electricity. But do not say people that they exercise can use special machine to create electricity. The they is not necessary here. We do not need that. And one more thing to remember is the information in identifying subject relative clause is essential. It is very, very important. Do not add a comma before this type of a clause. For example, people who care about the environment often recycle their garbage. The relative clause tells which people. And the school uses the electricity that comes from the exercise machines in the gym. The relative clause tells which electricity. And the verb in the relative clause agrees with the noun that the relative pronouns modifies. For example, someone that supports the environment recycles. The singular noun someone need a singular verb supports to go with it. And another example is many people that support the environment recycle. Here, the noun people is a plural noun and we need a plural verb to go with it. We have just finished the formation of a subject relative clause, and now we come with the uses of it. We use an identifying relative clause to give essential information about a noun. Remember the word essential. That is very important. These clauses are called restrictive subject clauses. And for example, people power is a kind of energy. What kind of energy? What is important about it? People power is a kind of energy that creates electricity. The relative clause gives essential information about the energy. And remember, we use an identifying relative clause in definitions, especially with words such as anyone, people, someone, or something. For example, green energy is something which doesn't hurt the environment. And environmentalists are people who care about the environment. Here we have definitions about green energies, definition about environmentalists. Alright, we have just talked about identifying subject relative clauses, and now we come to the non-identifying subject relative clauses. Non-identifying subject relative clauses have the same form as identifying clauses. Unlike identifying clauses, non-identifying clauses provide additional or non-essential information about the nouns they modify. Remember that the information is just additional and non-essential. For example, biodiesel fuel, which often comes from plants, is an economical source of energy. Where the fuel comes from is extra information. It is not essential information about biodiesel fuel. Now we're going to learn how to form non-identifying subject relative clauses. Like identifying subject relative clauses, the subject of a non-identifying subject relative clause is the relative pronoun. And the relative pronoun refers to the noun before it. We use who for people and which for things. Remember that we don't use that in non-identifying clauses. For example, people power, which is a way to create energy, is popular. Remember, do not use people power. That is a way to create electricity and is popular. That is not correct here. And remember to use commas before and after the non-identifying subject relative clause. The commas indicate that the information is not essential to the meaning of the noun. It is extra information. Remember that it's just extra information. And we have an example like hybrid cars, which are better for the environment, use less gas. That is all about the formation of the non-identifying subject relative clauses. And now we come to the uses of a non-identifying subject relative clause. People use a non-identifying subject relative clause to give non-essential information about a noun. Remember the word non-essential information. These clauses are also called non-restrictive clauses. For example, people power, which is a way to create energy, is popular with the environmentalists. And non-identifying relative clauses are more common in writing and formal speaking than in informal speaking. Now, I think we need to make a comparison to see how identifying and non-identifying subject relative clauses are different. Identifying relative clauses provide essential information about the noun. The information in the clause identifies or distinguishes the noun. Remember that the information is very essential. For example, renewable energy that comes directly from the sun is called solar energy. The information identifies a particular type of renewable energy, not all type of energy. And in this example, my sister who lives in Maine loves being outside. The information distinguishes this sister from the other or others. It implies that there is more than one sister. And remember that non-identifying clauses give extra information about a noun. The information is not essential. In speaking, we use a short pause before and after the clause. In writing, we separate the clause between commas. For example, renewable energy, which releases fewer greenhouse gases, is becoming more popular. The information does not identify the type of renewable energy. It gives more information about it. And in this example, my sister who lives in Maine loves being outside. The information is extra, not essential. It also implies the speaker has only one sister. Alright, here we come with a new word that is a whose. That is a subject relative clauses with whose. Subject relative clauses that begin with the pronoun whose show possession. For example, in Sweden, there are train commuters. The commuter's body heat supplies energy for a building. And we can say, in Sweden, there are train commuters whose body heat supplies energy for a building. I'm sure that this type of relative clause is also very familiar with you, and anyway, we need to learn how to form this type of clause. Remember that the pronoun whose shows a possessive relationship between the noun before and after it. For example, we have the sentence, they are the scientists whose research has won awards. The research belongs to the scientist. And in this sentence, that is the product whose inventor attended this college. The product is related to the inventor. And remember that the verb in the relative clause agrees with the noun following whose. For example, he's the scientist whose newest idea is often quoted. And remember that the word idea here is a singular noun, so we need a singular verb to go with it. And we have another example. For example, he's the scientist whose ideas are often quoted. Ideas here is a plural noun, so we need a plural verb to go with it. I think the use of this type of clause is not a big deal with most of you, but we need to review a little bit. Relative clauses with whose can be identifying or non-identifying subject relative clauses. For example, we have the sentence, they are the journalists whose articles have explained green energy. The information in the clause identifies which journalists. And in this sentence, Brad Pitt, whose movies are well known, gives a lot of money to the environmental causes. The information about his movies is not essential to identifying Brad Pitt. Alright, we have just finished almost everything about subject-relative clauses, and now we come with the object-relative clauses. And I know that they are not very new to you. Most of you here know them, but we need to review a little bit. In an object-relative clause, the relative pronoun is the object of the clause. An identifying object-relative clause gives essential information about the noun it modifies. For example, evidence is sometimes inaccurate. Police collect this evidence. We can use the relative pronoun that to replace the word this evidence. So we have evidence that police collect is sometimes inaccurate. We have just learned about the definition of identifying object-relative clauses, and now we come with a formation. The object-relative pronoun follows the noun it replaces and comes at the beginning of the relative clause. In an object-relative clause, the relative pronoun is the object of the clause. For example, humans aren't aware of smells. A dog can recognize smells. Here we can see the word smells appear twice, so we can replace one with a relative pronoun. So we have humans aren't aware of smells that a dog can recognize. And remember to use the relative pronouns who, that, or whom with people, and we can use which or that for things. For example, we have detectives are people who, that, whom I respect tremendously. These pronouns are frequently omitted in speaking but not in formal writing. For example, in writing we can say forensic evidence is something which or that police count on. But in speaking we may say forensic evidence is something police count on. And when referring to people, that is more common than who. The pronoun whom is very formal, and it is much less common than that or who in conversation. We have a scale from the least formal to the most formal, and consider the examples. Detective Paula Cho is a person that I admire very much. This one is the least formal. And another sentence is Detective Paula Cho is the person who I admire very much. This one is in the middle. And the most formal one is Detective Paula Cho is the person whom I admire very much. And we use whose and a noun to show possession. Remember that whose cannot be omitted. For example, the person whose car the thieves stole was a friend of mine. Now let's consider using identifying object-relative clauses. We use an identifying relative clause to give essential information that defines or identifies the noun it modifies. Remember the word essential information because that one is very important. For example, evidence that criminals leave at the crime scene is called forensic evidence. That criminals leave at the crime scene identifies the information. That clause is very important. We can now move on to non-identifying object-relative clauses. Non-identifying object-relative clauses have the same form as identifying clauses. Unlike identifying clauses, non-identifying clauses provide additional non-essential information about the nouns they modify. For example, evidence from crimes, which we call forensic evidence, can help police solve cases. The clause, which we call forensic evidence, is just extra information. It is not essential to understanding evidence from crimes. I'm sure that forming non-identifying object-relative clauses is not a big deal with most of you in our class, but we need to review a little bit of this. We need to remember that we can use who or whom for people, and we can use which for things. We use whose for possessive people and things, not just people. For example, the Sherlock Holmes stories were written by the Scottish author Arthur Conan Doyle, who or whom many people think was English. And remember that we do not use that in non-identifying relative clauses. For example, forensic science, which Sherlock Holmes used, has been recognized as science since the 1800s. Not forensic science that Sherlock Holmes used has been recognized as science since the 1800s. Remember, we do not use that in this kind of relative clause. And do not omit the relative pronoun in non-identifying object clauses. For example, the character Sherlock Holmes, who Arthur Conan Doyle created, was a fictional detective. We do not say the character Sherlock Holmes Arthur Conan Doyle created was a fictional detective. This sentence is not correct. And remember to use commas before and after the non-identifying object relative clause. For example, Arthur Conan Doyle, whose medical clinic not many patients attended, had time to write his stories. The next part is object relative clauses as objects of prepositions. The relative pronouns in object relative clauses can be the object of prepositions. For example, there's the police officer. I spoke to her. We can use relative pronoun whom and the preposition to. For example, we have the sentence, there's the police officer to whom I spoke. Or we can have another way to say it like, there's the police officer who I spoke to. Remember that the prepositions in object relative clauses can come at the end of the clause in informal speaking and writing. For example, we can say the police examined the chair that which I was sitting on. The witness whom I spoke to yesterday will appear in quote. In identifying relative clauses, remember to use the relative pronouns who, that, or whom for people and that or which for things. We can also omit the relative pronoun. For example, we can say the police examined the chair that which I was sitting on, or we can omit the relative pronoun. The police officer whom I met with was robbed, or we can omit the relative pronoun here. In non-identifying relative clauses, remember to use the relative pronouns who or whom for people and which for things. You cannot omit the relative pronoun. For example, the door which I entered through was broken during the crime. The witness whom I spoke to yesterday will appear in quote. Not the witness I spoke to yesterday will appear in quote. And also remember that in more formal spoken and especially in written English, the preposition comes before the relative pronouns whom or which. Do not use that or who. For example, the police examined the chair on which I was sitting. Not the police examined the chair on that I was sitting. We do not say that after a preposition. Or the witness with whom I spoke yesterday will appear in quote. Do not say the witness with who or with that I spoke yesterday will appear in quote. And also remember that you cannot omit the relative pronoun in this clause. For example, we can not say the police examined the chair on I was sitting, or the witness with I spoke yesterday will appear in quote. We need to have relative pronouns. Wahoo! We have just finished the relative pronoun, and now we come with the relative adverbs. The adverbs where and when can be used in relative clauses. Where is used to modify nouns of place, and when is used to modify nouns of time. In these cases, we call these word relative adverbs. For example, the computer lab is a place where many young students feel comfortable, and night is a time when many young students study for exams. Now let's review how to use where and when in different situations. We use where in relative clauses to modify a noun referring to a place. And some common nouns include area, country, house, place, and room. For example, we have this is the only area where you can find Wi-Fi outside of the office. Or the United States is a country where a lot of research on young people is done. The office is a place where workers often compete. Do not use a preposition before where. Use which instead. The use of preposition and which is common in academic writing. For example, it is a city in which you can find Wi-Fi almost everywhere. We do not say it is a city in where you can find Wi-Fi almost everywhere. We can never say in where. What about when? We use when in relative clauses to modify a noun referring to a time. And some common nouns include day, moment, period, season, time, and year. For example, the day when you graduate is the day when you will need to find a job. Or spring is the time when most students graduate. Or the 1980s and 1990s are the years when many young people in the workforce were born. Do not use a preposition before when. We use which instead. The use of preposition and which is very formal. For example, summer is the time during which many jobs become available. Remember, do not say summer is the time during when many jobs become available. And the day on which you start your new job will be very busy. Do not say the day on when you start your new job will be very busy. You can omit the relative adverb when in identifying relative clauses. For example, Ricardo remembered the moment he met his boss. We can say Ricardo remembered the moment when he met his boss. So we can omit when in identifying relative clauses. Ta-da! Here we come a very important point of relative clauses that is called reduction, or we can call it reduced relative clauses. Relative clauses with be can often be reduced to phrases. And remember that there are three types of reduced relative clauses. The first one is participle phrases, the second one is prepositional phrases, and the third one is positives. For example, the expert who is giving tomorrow's talk on millennials is very well known, or we can say the expert giving tomorrow's talk on millennials is very well known. This part is quite important in relative clauses, so we need to spend a little bit of time to review how to form a reduced relative clause. Reduce a subject relative clause by omitting the relative pronoun that, which, and who, and the verb be. For example, my brother, a millennial, likes a fast-paced environment. Or we can say, my brother, who is a millennial, likes a fast-paced environment. Remember that we do not shorten a subject relative clause with be and a single adjective. Instead, we move the adjective before the modified noun. For example, we have I know a lot of people who are self-confident. We do not say I know a lot of people self-confident, but instead we say I know a lot of self-confident people. Remember, do not say I know a lot of people self-confident. It's not correct. And do not reduce object relative clauses. For example, we can say our new assistant who I'm meeting tomorrow is a millennial, but do not say our new assistant meeting tomorrow is a millennial. Now we are going to review how to reduce relative clauses with participle phrases. Participle phrases are a reduced form of relative clauses with a verb that includes a form of be. For example, students concerned with the environment should get involved in environmental groups on campus. That is the shortened form of students who are concerned with the environment should get involved in environmental groups on campus. And remember that this verb can be in the form of ing verb, present participle, or the past participle form. This includes progressive verb and passive verbs. For example, here's the person using the internet too much at work. or she did the things not expected of her. This is the intern known to be the hardest working. What about reduced relative clauses with prepositional phrases? You can omit the relative pronoun and the verb be when they are followed by a prepositional phrase in identifying relative clauses. For example, the computer in our classroom are fast. This is the shortened form of the computers that are in our classroom are fast. And remember that an adjective can also come before the prepositional phrase. For example, young workers low in self-esteem are unusual. Now we come with a very common part of reduced relative clause, that is appositives. You can omit the relative pronoun and the verb be when they are followed by a noun phrase in non-identifying relative clauses. This is called appositive. For example, Chen Smith, an expert on millennials, will be speaking at noon today. That is the shortened form of Chen Smith, who is an expert on millennials, will be speaking at noon today. And often the position of the demodified noun and the appositive is interchangeable. For example, we can say an expert on millennials, Chen Smith, will be speaking at noon today instead of the above sentence. And remember that appositives begin and end with commas. For example, resumes, brief documents that summarize an applicant's work background are necessary for all job applicants. But remember that in academic writing, appositives often occur in parentheses instead of commas. For example, resumes, brief documents that summarize an applicant's work background are necessary for all job applicants. Now we come to the very last part of the presentation, the to infinitive to replace a relative clause. Remember that a to infinitive clause can replace a defining relative clause after ordinal numbers like the first, the second, the third, etc. and after superlatives like the best, the most beautiful, etc. and after the next, the last, the only. For example, we have Ethan is usually the last person to understand the joke, or Ethan is usually the last person who understands the joke. We have another example, like his office was the next room to clean. It means his office was the next room that they had to clean. And remember that passive infinitive are also possible. For example, we have his was the last composition to be marked. It means his was the last composition which was marked. Woohoo! This is the end of my presentation, and you can now go ahead with the activities in the practice sections. Thank you for watching and see you again.